Welcome, everybody, to the Tree Fund webinar series. We will go ahead and kick off our webinar on this, at least down here in South Alabama, beautiful sunny day that we're having here. We have a great program for you ahead of you today. As many of you know, my name is Bo Broadbeck. I work with Auburn University Extension, and we are always happy, and it's a pleasure to be able to host and moderate the Tree Fund webinar series. As you all know, this webinar series is made possible through the research that is supported by many of you all, by many of our organizations, by our crown partners or gold partners that you see listed on this slide that make this webinar series possible through the research that is funded through Tree Fund. Tree Fund is an organization that supports research in the fields of arboriculture and urban forestry. We look at ensuring that we are funding applied research that has implications for practicing arborists and urban foresters around the world. Next slide. So I wanted to jump into a few housekeeping notes before I introduce today's speakers. So as many of y'all know, we are pre-qualified for both ISA and SAF CEUs. And as is our practice on the Tree Fund webinar series, when you signed into the webinar series, you provided your name and certification number, and we will take the records, attendance records from today's webinar and share those directly to ISA on your behalf. So there is no need for you all to share your certification number. We should have captured that, and we will send it to ISA on your behalf. ISA asks for about 4 to 6 weeks to post those CEUs. As you all can see, we got about 680 people on. It's a lot of people for them to process. Next slide. As you all know, we have a few other webinars coming up on the horizon. We will be back on November 5th. With Dr. Greg Dahl, who's going to be presenting on tree-caused outages and what we know and what we have learned. And then we'll be back for our last webinar for 2024 before we launch our 2025 series, of course. And we'll be down with Dr. Rebecca Abney and Julia Campbell from the University of Georgia. And they will be presenting a presentation on biochar for tree growth and water quality, exploring potential in urban and disturbed soils. Next slide. So I would like to remind everybody that what makes these webinars possible is the support from our arborists and urban foresters from around the world. And so if you see value in these webinars, if you see value in this research, please remember that you can support Tree Fund, and through Tree Fund, the research like the research we'll be learning today. And you can always go back and look at past research that we have funded in past webinars through going back to our webinar archive on treefund.org. So without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce today's speaker. So we have actually 3 presenters with us today, and I'll go through a couple of their bios, and then one of the researchers will present the other. So we have Dr. Robert Fahey, who's an associate professor at the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Fahey is an associate professor. His primary areas of research is applied forest ecology with a focus on canopy structure, function, relationships, particularly in relation to disturbance and climate change resilience across the spectrum of anthropogenic impacts. He receives his Bachelor's of Science from Cornell University, his Master of Science from Oregon State University, and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is also the director of the Yukon Forest George F. Coultier Professor of Forestry and Associate Director of the Eversource Energy Center at Yukon. Also with us today is Dr. Lara Roman, who's a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station in Philadelphia Field Station. She studies the temporal dynamics of urban forests, including tree mortality and growth, canopy coverage change, historical development of urban forests, species composition change, and citizen science monitoring. Her studies take a particular research approach, collaborating with practitioners for study design and implementation. She has been funded by the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, the Tree Fund, the Garden Club of America, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, and various other organizations. She received her PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's in biology and a master's of environmental studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Roman is currently the chair of the Urban Tree Growth and Longevity Working Group, an affiliate of the International Society of Arboriculture. We welcome both of you to this webinar series, and as well as Levon Bigelow, who I think Dr. Fahey will introduce. So I'll turn the virtual floor over to you. If you want to stop sharing our screen so our presenters can. Thank you all very much for being here and looking forward to the presentation.
All right, Lara, do you want to share your screen?
Yep. So we're all going to present on Philly street tree survival, as you heard, and I'm going to kick it over to Bob to do Levon's introduction and talk about how this all came together.
Yeah, so thanks for having us. And hopefully I make it through the introduction with my voice. But Levon Bigelow is the other presenter on here, and really the driving force behind all of the work that you'll see. This work was conducted as part of his master's thesis here at the University of Connecticut, where he worked with me and Lara and a whole group of people that you can see a lot on here. Levon, before coming to work at UConn, also worked in New York City and also at New Jersey Forest Service, and then following his master's again at the New Jersey Forest Service, and now is working as an ORISE fellow with Lara out in California, working on a schoolyard trees project. So the genesis of this project, the reason we're giving this presentation to Tree Fund is because they gave us money, and very thankful for that. So when you look at the funding support over there, we did get a project funded by Tree Fund that we then leveraged with funding from the U.S. Forest Service and also with National Needs Fellowship that Levon was supported by here at the University of Connecticut. So a large group of funders and then an even larger group of collaborators that have worked on this project over the last several years, including from Forest Service, from Rutgers, from the University of Connecticut, from Davie, and then a giant field crew across multiple years with all the names you can see there. So it's a big collaborative effort that has spanned multiple cities. We're going to talk about Philadelphia today, but we've also done some similar work in New York City, and we'll hopefully continue this project on into the future. So Lara, are you going to take it, or Levon?
Yep, I'm up next.
Okay, have at it.
So we're going to give a little bit of background on the need for urban tree monitoring, talk a little about our overall study design, and then Levon will present the in-depth methods and findings from street tree plot monitoring in Philadelphia in 2015 to 2021. So why is it important to monitor street trees? I imagine many of the people on here who are involved professionally with street tree management can think of some reasons. What we thought of is street trees are, of course, important for human health and well-being, but knowing how they change over time can impact how those benefits are actually provided. Street trees are also, though they may be a small fraction of the overall urban tree canopy, much more of the canopy might be found in parks and residential yards, but street trees are a huge part of the investment as far as municipal parks and other departments that are responsible for those trees. And also the sustainable management of street trees requires human intervention. These are trees that we plant as a society, we remove, we hopefully care for as they are growing and aging. And also trees in this street tree environment, in sidewalk spaces, medians, and so forth, they can have safety concerns. This can be another major part of municipal arboriculture. And we want to understand changes in trends. So what's the balance of planting and mortality? How are the trees growing? What's impacting the factors that might relate to trees dying and being removed? And that's going to be the focus of today. And then to give you a little bit of background on Philadelphia. So I'm actually moved 2 years ago to California, but I will always be a Philly girl at heart. It's my hometown and also where I worked for the Forest Service for 10 years before going west. And it's a post-industrial city that at its peak in the mid-20th century had 2 million people, but like many formerly industrial powerhouses shrunk. So it now has about 1.6 million residents. It's fairly densely populated, a lot of attached housing, apartments in some part of the city, but also variation in different neighborhoods. And it's a city that has faced substantial cuts to its municipal parks department over the years, but with a lot of exciting developments lately, which we will get into towards the end of the presentation as far as a really ambitious and wonderful urban tree management plan. And so street trees fall under the jurisdiction in Philadelphia of the Philadelphia Parks and Recreation Department, some amazing colleagues we have there. And then, although formally the trees are under that department, a variety of other governmental and non-governmental groups are involved in the planting, stewardship, and long-term care of these trees. So for instance, the Philadelphia Water Department plants trees and maintains them as part of their green stormwater infrastructure movement. And then a variety of other institutional landholders are responsible for street trees in their areas, including universities as well as business districts. And then there are a great many nonprofit partners, including, of course, the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society and their incredible tree tenders program, as well as numerous other neighborhood-based nonprofit groups and stewardship groups that do a lot of tree planting and care. And now I'm going to kick it over to Levon. Or wait, no, am I doing this part? Sorry, I'm doing this part too. So the objectives of the overall study are to analyze composition, structure, and characteristics of the street tree community, and then also assess factors associated with street tree survival and mortality. This map shows you all of these plots. You'll hear us talking a lot about plots. The tradition in forest ecology is to have often circular plots or sometimes transects that are viewed as permanent plots that can enable longitudinal monitoring, with longitudinal meaning tracking the same individual trees over time. And the data is then linked tree by tree. So we were following in that grand tradition from forest ecology, but doing it in plots that made sense for a street tree setting. So what we have is 103 permanent plots. Each plot is a half mile of road that randomly turns corners. And so this will help make a little more sense. All those green dots are trees that survived. The red dots are trees that died. And so we had really meticulous location data to make sure that we were looking at the same exact tree in the original baseline 2015 data and then the repeat monitoring in 2021. And this involved taking a measuring wheel along the curb and making sure that we were measuring the distance from a sidewalk corner to each individual tree. We also recorded address and site code. That's something many commercially done municipal inventories will include. And we also have a photo of every single individual tree. We also had a pretty strict definition of what is a tree and a street tree for this study. And this is important so we can compare apples to apples over the time period. If we were to just send in turns out and say, record all the street trees you see, each individual person might interpret what street tree means a little differently. And so by our definition, street trees are in sidewalk spaces or medians. And we also excluded certain species as not being trees. So for instance, some of the dogwoods that are more shrubby, we did not consider trees. And then we followed protocols that are in 2 Forest Service publications that I co-led with Natalie Van Doorn, another Forest Service scientist. These are general technical reports from my agency. They had a lot of co-authors, both from research and practice. So the Urban Tree Monitoring Field Guide is detailed protocols about how to do these measurements, and the Resource Guide is strategies about how to carry out these projects well. And now I'll turn it over to Levon.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. This is really exciting. It's really exciting to see where everybody's come from. And so without further ado, we have some photos here for why it's so important, I think, to collect the meticulous location data. which Lara had described. And so on the left, you see an example. These are examples where it's easy to find a tree from the first time point, whether it's a stump or a tree that's standing, alive or dead. But on the next slide, you'll see 3 examples of where it's not so easy to find that same tree if you don't have. So on the left, you see an example of where a stump was ground. So you can't exactly tell where precisely that was if you weren't using those precise locating methods. And on the 2 photos on the right, you can see examples where a previous pit has now been poured over with concrete, and so there are new concrete flags there. So those are just a few examples. So here are the various pieces of data that we collected. In the column on the left, you'll see examples of the data that were collected in the field for each tree, which include species, trunk diameter to the nearest tenth of an inch or 1/4 centimeter. And all of the units are in metric for the presentation, but I'll do my best to give the US customary version as well. And then there are a number of variables that get amalgamated into a variable called ground vigor. So that includes fine twig dieback, leaf discoloration, and defoliation. And ground vigor is roughly, you can think about it as being constant. We also collected type and land use for each tree, the number of sides that the crown of the tree is exposed to sunlight, and the presence or absence of overhead wires. And in terms of species characteristics that were collected after the field collection season, included drought tolerance level and expected mature stature. And expected mature stature is how tall that we would expect the tree to be when it grows to be its full, when it grows to maturity. And 3 different classes for that include small, medium, and large. And those are 25 feet, 7.6 meters. So on the next slide, we can see an example of our wonderful crew members at the first training plot. They collected all of this data, and they're all magnificent. And on the next slide, you'll see a photo of Dr. Jason Henning, who works with Davey Tree and also the U.S. Forest Service Philadelphia Urban Field Station, and myself collecting some validation data to assess the accuracy of the data that the crew members collected. And spoiler alert, they collected great data. So thank you for that. So moving on to objective 1. As Lara mentioned, objective 1 involves looking at the composition, structure, and characteristics of the community. So on the next slide, we'll see how we broke that objective down into 3 sub-objectives, which include looking at composition, structure, and attributes of the tree community and how they might have changed between 2015 and 2021. So we'll start with composition, looking at the taxa level. That's family, genus, and species. And one of the benchmarks that we use to characterize the composition includes the 10-20-30 rule popularized by Frank Sandmore, I believe in 1990, which states that in a given area, no individual species should represent more than 10% of the population, no individual genus should represent more than 20% of the population, and no individual family should represent more than 30% of the population. And though it may not be the best rule, it's a rule and a good benchmark to at least conditions. So on the next slide, we begin by looking at families within this study. So the 2 most abundant families, this is a Cleveland dot plot, which shows relative abundances, which is the individual tree counts, looking at one time point, 2015, which is represented by the orange dots, and 2021, which is represented by the blue dots. And again, the threshold that we're looking for is 30%. And we can see, Lara, if you click one more time, the Sapindaceae family, which represents the maples primarily, and the Rosaceae family, which contains a lot of the flowering trees along the East Coast, like your cherries, your hawthorns, and your crab apples. Those are both under that 30% threshold. That's pretty decent there. There's a slight decrease in the relative abundance of the maple family, and a slight increase of the Rosaceae family, which are small, relatively small to medium stack. So that increase may be reflecting something that we'll be talking about later, which is compatible. And that's just a pretty flower. So now moving on to the genus, is the abundance of genera in this study. Again, the threshold that we're looking for the genus 2015. Well, we see that in 2015, the Acer genus, which is the maple genus, Can you hear me? Someone says it's breaking up a little bit. I talk a little bit louder, a little closer to the mic. Can you hear me, Lara?
A little closer to the mic might help, yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll talk louder and a little bit closer to the mic. Thank you for letting me know about that. So in terms of the genera, let me know if it's breaking up more, but just let me know. So in terms of the genera, the Acer genus it represented more than 20% in 2015, at 21.6%, but that is decreased slightly to 18%. Thank you for letting me know, everybody. I appreciate that. So it's gotten below that 20% threshold, which is more along the lines of what we're looking for in terms of that 10, 20, 30 rule, which is decent. And so that might be a combination, which we'll look at in just a moment. It might be a combination of what died and what was removed in one time point, and also what was planted by the people who planted trees in the city. And we'll look more closely at that in just a moment. So moving on to the next slide, we'll see species abundance. And again, the threshold that we're looking for is 10%. And again, this is just a rule, perhaps the best rule. It is just a benchmark that in the two most abundant species, one of them is monospecific, which is London plane trees. If you click one more time, Lara, we'll see a photo of London planes, which are very common, I believe, all around the world because they're so urban tolerant and they do well in urban environments. So I don't really have a major issue per se with them being more abundant if they're doing the job that they're supposed to. And also that's not so much bigger than that 10% threshold that we're looking for. And again, we're looking at city level here. So that rule may be more applicable and more relevant at smaller scales, for example, in neighborhoods or regions of a city, but we're looking at city level. And in terms of the second species there, it's not necessarily monospecific. It's more the genus level. Those are the cherries, prunus species. And we're seeing a slight increase in the number of prunus species. And maybe when we take a look at the next section, we'll understand a little bit more why. But they tend to be smaller and medium in stature and perhaps better equipped for the streetscape environment. But we'll see as we move ahead. So now we'll move on to the second objective, where we're looking at the structure of the street tree community, which includes a look at the size class distribution and replacement. So on the next slide here, we see what's known as a size class curve, and we've got basically two bars that are grouped within the different size classes. The first two size classes are 3 inches in diameter or 7.6 centimeters in diameter. And the 2 years that we're looking at are 2015, 2021. 2015 is in blue, 2021 is in green. Overall, we see that the numbers in terms of the counts of the trees in both of those years, initially we had 2,657 trees among these plots. And in 2021, there were 2,542. That represents a net decrease of 115 trees, which you can see in those first two size class bins, which are 3 inches for the first two, becomes 6 inches as you move along. So in those first two size classes, we're seeing that there aren't as many trees being represented in those first two, the 0 to 3 and 3 to 6 inches in diameter, which reflects a potential lack in replacement of trees in those size class bins. So there might need to be more trees being planted in order to get those same canopy over time. If you look in the third size class bin, that 6 to 12 inch size class bin, there is an increase comparatively from 2021, which reflects established first two size class bins. So on the next slide, we'll see of what these two look like, where that it's a different way of looking at the same graph. We're seeing, if you click twice more actually, Lara, we'll see that rightward shift in that mode of the 2021 size class versus that 2015 class all the way on the left, where we might want to see a bit more replacement in order to get that same canopy over time. So that's just one look at structure for the analysis. And finally, we'll move on to the next section, which includes a look at the traits and attributes of the trees in our study. And while there are many different traits and attributes to look at, we're just looking at drought tolerance and expected mature stature. So we'll be looking at two different ways of analyzing these variables. First, we'll look at the number of the different individual from 2021, and then we'll be comparing the trees that died or were removed versus the new plantings. So here we're looking at the drought tolerance levels between 2015 and 2021. And okay, real choppy video feed is the same. So how about this? I'll turn off my video. Pardon me, it might be my connection issue. So I'll turn off my video and I'll try to stay very still. We'll see how that goes. Sorry about that.
It's clear again now for what it's worth, Levon. Yeah, once in a while it gets choppy, but
Okay,
try keeping
Okay.
that video off.
sounds good. My internet connection may not be the best here in Sacramento. I've been trying to work on that, but we'll hope that it goes smoothly for the rest of the presentation. Pardon me, everyone. So in terms of drought tolerance level, the main things to note here, Lara, if you click once more, we'll see that there is a decrease in the relative abundance of trees that are in that low to moderate drought tolerance level, which may be a reflection of what might be more advantageous in the street tree environment, which is very often water limited. So on the next slide, we can see that there in 2015, the trees that died or were removed can be found in green. And what I want you to look at is the relative abundances, the percentages. So there is a larger percentage of trees that died or were removed that were low to moderate drought tolerance. And perhaps that's not what would be the most advantageous in the water limited street tree environment. And when we compare that to the trees that are newly planted since 2015, there are significantly more trees that are higher in drought tolerance levels, so about 50% of them. So moving on to the next slide, we can take a look at the expected mature stature in 2015 versus 2021. Trees that were, click once more for me, please, Lara. Trees that were in the smaller and medium expected mature stature in these different bins, pardon me, are 25 feet bins. So trees that are expected to be 5 feet by the time they're mature are small, 25 feet to 50 feet are medium, and then greater than 50 feet are large. We're seeing a greater percentage of trees that are small and medium in 2021 versus 2015, and trees that are large are experiencing a relative decrease in their abundance. And if we take a look at the next slide, we'll get another look of this pattern. So trees that died or were removed are in green, trees that are newly planted are here in orange. And you can see all the way on the right that 72.5% of trees that experience mortality were in that large size class bins. But trees are not, trees between 2015 and 2021 were experiencing significantly more mortality if they were expected to be large in stature or if they were large in stature. And perhaps this has to do with something that I've mentioned so far and will mention more as we continue into this presentation, which is the issue of species abilities. So in the street tree environment, we have two at least major limitations and challenges that trees face, which include the limited water that's available in the street tree environment and also the limited soil availability. And so that might play into trees that are large, expected to be large in stature, because the larger the tree is expected to be, the more soil it tends to need. And also there may be some conflicts when it comes to the biophysical infrastructure, including overhead wires, which we'll see as we move on. But just to wrap up objective 1, we see that the composition is trending towards the 10-20-30 rule, which is objectively decent. At least one benchmark that we're looking for. I can say objectively, I should say that in terms of a benchmark, it is a decent initial benchmark to move towards. Pardon me, the connection issue got me a little bit off track, but I'll get back there, I promise. In terms of structure, tree diameter is increasing, but there's a potential lack in replacement of survival. And so if we're looking to sustain that canopy over time, what we would look for is to match the outputs, so what has experienced mortality events with inputs. So planting trees to replace those smaller size class bins. And in terms of traits and attributes, we're seeing comparatively more trees that are high in drought tolerance level and comparatively less trees that are expected to be large in stature. And for now, we can move on to objective 2, which comprises the bulk of this study. In objective 2, we wanted to conduct an analysis of factors that are associated with street tree survival and mortality. So this was, no, it is not our friend, pardon me. So we look at objective 2, we wanted to break it down into 3 sub-objectives, which include a look at the traits and attributes of individual trees, the local site characteristics around a tree, and the neighborhood social context. And we wanted to compare effect sizes within different variables. And as we move forward, we'll get a better understanding of what that means. But before we continue, just want to situate us within the context of tree survival and mortality. So as Lara mentioned earlier, mortality can be defined as where trees died or were removed, right? So when we think about mortality in the traditional sense of any organism, really, after trees experience a certain period of growth, they eventually decline, senesce, and experience failure. But in the urban environment, trees can also be removed due to human intervention, right? So this might include the safety risks. So we might remove a tree that poses safety risks preemptively before it actually experiences failure. But trees can also be removed due to human preferences and perceptions. So perceived future infrastructure conflicts, for example, or just due to the human preferences. And in terms of construction and development, trees can be either damaged during construction events, or they can be removed entirely during development. And we'll take a look at that as we move forward. So with the next slide here, we're looking at the first category of potential predictors of tree survival. And so for the rest of this presentation, we'll be talking about tree mortality more in the context of survival, because they're two sides of the same coin, but it's a bit easier to interpret. So the variables related to tree traits and attributes include crown vigor, which again is that measure of crown condition. Also, we wanted to incorporate size, so diameter, within this analysis, and the way that the data revealed to be the best way to look at tree diameter would be looking at small trees, so trees that are 0 to 3 inches in diameter compared to trees that are larger than 3 inches in diameter. We also looked at drought tolerance level and expected mature stature. And in terms of the local biophysical environment, we looked at site type, percent impervious surface within a 15-meter buffer. 15 meters is approximately 50 feet. Crown light exposure, so the number of sides that the crown is exposed to light, and presence or absence of overhead wires. And finally, for the neighborhood social context, we looked at a number of different variables, which include land use, which is how the land is being used by humans in the local area. We also looked at construction activity. So take a look over at the right-hand side of the screen. You'll see ArcPro, which is a geographic information system software, which enabled us to look at the parcels different within the city of Philadelphia and pair demolition permits. We looked specifically at demolition events. We paired individual parcels with permit events. So we were able to get parcel level data, and that's really unique for studies. And we're seeing that more and more parcel level data, especially for construction events. We also looked at stewardship group turf. It was a little bit of a coarse polygon, so it didn't capture stewardship events that were taking place at a specific tree at the individual tree level, more just the general polygon that stewardship group operated in. And just to do a little spoiler alert, it turned out to be not significant, and perhaps for that purpose. We also looked at a number of different variables that were collected at the U.S. Census Bureau American Community Survey at the census tract level. So while these variables were also collected at a somewhat coarse resolution at the census tract level, they still are able to point us in the direction of different patterns that might take place that can be looked at via further analysis and proper research studies that look more at the social environment around trees. And so these variables include percent of residents in poverty. Can you go back one more? Thank you. Percent of residents in poverty, percent unoccupied housing units, percent renter-occupied housing units, percent of residents that have years, and percent of residents with a bachelor's degree or higher. And these have all been associated with tree survival in previous urban mortality studies. So in terms of the overall annual mortality rate for the trees in this study, it was 3.7%, which is roughly comparable to two other large studies that looked specifically at street trees, including Oakland and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Whereas the Urban Tree Mortality Review, literature review, found a 2.3 to 2.6% annual mortality rate. However, the difference with that more encompassing literature review is that they looked at trees that were in other areas as well, so residential and park trees, not just street trees. In a final study conducted by Lara and colleagues, at trees on a Penn campus. So these were specifically street trees as well. And they found a 5.4% annual mortality rate. And that's a little bit higher. And what they found is that it was related to construction activity. And also that area had a lot higher impervious surfaces within the study area. So moving on to the next slide, we'll take a look at that. Is known as a size class mortality curve, and generally the trees in this study followed a type 3 mortality curve where the highest annual mortality rate was found in that smallest size class, and it generally decreases as you move along. So you can see in that first 0 to 7.6 centimeter size class bin, 3-inch size class bin, there was the highest annual mortality rate. Now we can move on into the logistic regression. So essentially, multivariate logistic regression allows us to compare an outcome to the different variables that may be associated with that outcome. Logistic regression is often used in human epidemiological studies where the researchers are trying to determine whether humans received, so the outcome is binary in logistic regression. So in human epidemiological studies, often they're looking to see if humans contracted a disease or they didn't, or whether a human died or they didn't. So we're doing the same thing here, and this has been applied to other mortality studies. And so this right here it's what's known as a forest plot. The name is just, it doesn't have anything to do with trees, but there are a few different things to note, and we'll break this down as we go. So I know there's a lot here and there's a lot to discuss. Essentially, the dots in the center of those bars represent an odds ratio. So if something's more likely to happen or not. Red represents a negative association with tree survival, and the gray represents an insignificant relationship at that level. And on the left, you'll see for the different variables, there's a variable on the outside of the brackets and a level for that variable on the inside of the brackets. So for example, if you look at expected stature, expected mature stature is the variable, and there are 3 different levels. They're small, medium, and large. You don't see large because large is the comparative worst level. And so what we're doing here is we're able to compare the variable with each other, and we compare them to a baseline. So Lara, if you click a couple times, we'll see the different categories of the different variables on the left, and we'll continue with that example of expected stature as we move forward. So as I mentioned before, click once more, Lara. If you take a look at the graph on the right, thank you very much. Can you click once more for me? There we go. Thank you. So you can see what I was referring to. The graph on the right represents annual mortality rate. And so the larger the bar, the less likely the trees were to survive. So as you can see, the large expected mature size class or size category experienced the highest annual mortality rate. So it was the comparative worst level. And it had the worst association with tree survival. And if we take a look at the next slide, we'll see why this might be. So trees that are expected to be large, so expected to be 50 feet or greater, typically have larger soil requirements. Over on the left, you can see that tree perhaps needed a little bit more soil than what it had available to it. This likely was related to its decline over time. Whereas if you take a look on the right, that London plane there was absolutely pruned in order to mitigate potential conflicts with the electric line at the top. So this potentially influenced its decline and senescence over time, and the tree is now dead. So again, species site compatibility is very important. And the next variable here is drought tolerance level. And on the next slide, we'll be able to see a comparison between the two. So trees that had low to medium drought tolerance level had a higher annual mortality rate compared to trees with a higher drought tolerance level. And as I mentioned earlier, the tree environment is a very water limited environment. It's also a soil limited environment. It can be, at least. We might expect that trees that have a higher tolerance to drought would fare better in the water limited environment. And taking a look at the next section, we've got a comparison. We're looking at two different variables here. We have crown condition and also small tree. Where tree was 2 to 3 inches in diameter or greater than that. So next, if Lara, you click one more time, we'll be able to see this chart here. And there's a lot going on here, but just break it down very, to make it very understandable. Left to the right of the graph, you see an increase in the condition of the initial time point. So in 2015, trees that were in poor or dying condition had a far higher annual mortality rate, so they were much more likely to experience mortality than trees that were in the excellent condition. Along, and that makes intuitive sense. If a tree's in poor condition initially, a lot less likely to survive than a tree that was in better condition initially. And with the small tree variable, it was insignificant just on its own. But if you take a look at this graph, and Lara, if you click one more time, you'll see where this variable became significant. And it's in the interaction between these two variables, looking at condition and looking at a small tree versus large tree. So in the initial time point, if a tree was in the excellent crown vigor condition class, experienced a higher annual mortality rate if it was a small tree. And I know that sounds like a lot, sounds a little confusing, but it's quite intuitive if we think about it. And we can take a look at the next slide to see some examples of why this might be. So you can imagine that the trees on the left, in the middle, and on the right there were all planted in excellent initial condition. But on the left, you can see an example of a tree which is small, experiencing a stressor in the urban environment. And this is an extreme example for sure, but it does paint the picture of small trees being more susceptible and having a challenge establishing in the urban environment. You take a look at the center photo, and if you take a look at the center photo, you'll be able to see that the tree experienced a vandalism event. And trees that are small are much more susceptible to vandalism because it's easier to take, home equipment, for example, and just remove that tree if the resident doesn't like it, or if someone in the neighborhood wants to remove them, or someone's just having a bad day, compared to a tree that's much larger in diameter. And if you take a look all the way on see a tree that was perhaps in excellent initial condition, but had something happen to it where the crown was perhaps broken out. And small trees are relatively, quote unquote, expendable. Whereas if the managers in that area would like a tree that's in great condition that will grow to be to have the expected crown shape and provide the ecosystem services and benefits that we to provide, then they would simply remove that tree and replace it with one that's in better condition. So for the next slide, we can continue and take a look at the second sub-objective, which is local site characteristics. So the first of the local site characteristics includes site bed. So I take a look at the graph on the right side. If we click once more, we'll be able to see that trees that were in sidewalk cutouts had the highest annual mortality rate compared to trees in sidewalk planting strips and medians. And taking a look at the next slide, we'll see why this might be. So sidewalk pits in the city of Philadelphia can be quite small. So as small as 24 inches by 24 inches, which is very small. It's not a lot of room for a tree to grow, necessarily the ideal environment. Trees, and so this variable might well be related to the available soil volume around a tree. When you take a look at the center photo, you'll see that in sidewalk planting strips, there's that lateral pathway for the roots to expand out. And so you might be able to plant trees that require a bit more soil volume. And when you take a look all the way on the right, I mean, some of the medians in the city of Philadelphia are huge, and there's clearly enough room for the soil, for the roots to expand out and get all the nutrients that they need, and also for the water to infiltrate down into the soil, which we know that trees need as well. And taking a look at the next slide, we'll see that percent impervious surface in a 15-meter buffer was negatively associated with tree survival. And so this relationship here is, as the percentage of impervious surface increases, there is a lower likelihood of survival for the tree. And this is perhaps related to the amount of heat stress in the local environment. So finally, if we move on to the next slide, we'll look at the neighborhood social context, which again is a combination of how the local environment is being used by humans, but also aspects of the social context. And so the next slide, we'll take a look at land use. And so the baseline level for this variable was commercial and industrial areas of Philadelphia, which experienced the highest annual mortality rate compared to residential and park and other land uses. And on the next slide, we might get an example of why this might be, and this might be related to soil compaction. So if you take a look all the way to the left, you'll see an example of a honey locust that is in a sidewalk planting pit, a sidewalk cutout, same difference really. And if you take a look at the soil, especially compared to the residential and the park area, it's very compacted. It's not quite the best quality soil. Even though that honey locust is doing well, they tend to do well in urban environment. It's not the ideal environment for that tree. So on the next slide, we'll be able to see one interesting finding, which is demolition events. Now, this is something that has been found in recent years and is being found more and more, that trees that were at parcels that experienced demolition events were less likely to than trees that were at parcels that didn't experience demolition events. And this is pretty significant finding, and it paints to how we might be able to look at perhaps tree protections in the future. And finally, we'll wrap this section up by taking a look at the neighborhood socioeconomic context. So I want to reiterate that these variables were collected at the census tract level, and they're relatively coarse. They do point out some patterns that we can at least try to parse out, and at the very least, it highlights areas for further research. So as the number of residents that were in poverty increased, there was a decrease in the likelihood for tree survival. Now, we're not sure exactly what this means. It could mean a number of different things, really. It could mean that there's an increase in management that's needed to take place in these different areas, so trees that are in poor condition that need to be removed. But it could also be related to the tendency that has been found in a number of different studies that in neighborhoods of lower socioeconomic status, tree pit sizes tend to be smaller. So perhaps there are a number of different things, number of different pathways that need further exploration. In terms of percent of renter-occupied housing units and percent unoccupied housing units, both of those levels are positively associated with tree survival. And we're not entirely sure what this means. It might mean that there's a lack of calls going into 311, perhaps a lack of sense of ownership for trees that are in poor condition that may need to be removed. But again, we're not entirely sure. And there's a large confidence interval for percent of renter-occupied housing units. And so take that with a grain of salt, perhaps. And so now on the next slide, we'll wrap this study up with some discussions and implications. And so we start with the understanding that just like all living beings, all trees will die eventually. And that's, of course, what makes, but having that understanding enables us to have an initial understanding that we need to balance a number of different things. So we have seen that there has been a number of different patterns which might point to us balancing out mortality and planting. So in order for us to sustain a canopy over time and get the benefits from trees that we would like to see, we would need to sustain the canopy by replacing the trees in the smaller size classes that are shifting and growing into the larger size classes. And a lot of these implications in this discussion section, it's a lot of information that you probably already know. So hopefully I'm just reiterating things that we might have an understanding of already. And in terms of services and costs, all of this costs money. trees cost money, management costs money, people cost money, of course. And there are services that trees provide. In order for us to maximize those services, we need to find that balance of the costs associated. And that might be a challenge in a city like Philadelphia, which Lara might explain as we move on to the next slide, but also species site compatibility, which I mentioned a number of times. You might have heard the slogan, right tree, right place, and that is so crucial and so important. When it comes to expected mature stature, when it comes to drought tolerance, we want to make sure that the requirements for a species fits the site in which it's planted. And that goes such a long way, especially when it comes to that balance, for example, in the next bullet of matching the biophysical requirements and the human environment. So trees have certain needs. And so for matching the needs of the species to the site, we're also incorporating what humans need, because we live in these cities and we have certain requirements. There's a balance that can be struck in order to allow us to mutually coexist. And so among those include improving young tree survival. And in terms of the demolition events, perhaps instituting some form of tree protections during demolition events. And when I used to work in New York City, there was something known as the restitution fund for trees that were damaged during construction events. So perhaps that's one way that might be enforced and to enable the tree protections. And also, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the costs, capacity limitations may be a challenge that the city of Philadelphia faces, but Lara will hint in the next slide that they are already thinking about these things and moving on to how they might some solutions for these issues. So thank you for your time, and pardon the choppiness in internet. Thank you very much.
Great, so I'm going to take over for the last few slides. As far as future research goes, we have a lot of possibility to continue measuring these plots. As alluded to earlier, they are conceived of as permanent plots. And with all of the planting activity that's going on through the Inflation Reduction Act, so that for those of you that aren't from the US, this is a huge investment from the federal government, part of which is going towards urban and community forestry. So Philadelphia received a $12 million grant that is about planting, maintenance, and many other things. So there's the potential to see the impact of that if we were to go back and remeasure in 2027. We also could potentially investigate some of the social science aspects that our first study was not able to look into. So things like management differences across plots, residents and pedestrians' perceptions and opinions, and how that may be influencing tree survival, growth, and health. And also, as Bob mentioned at the start of our webinar, we have parallel plots set up in New York City, and there's the potential for comparison across the two cities, which have pretty different management systems. New York City is also much, much larger with a much larger parks department, and the possibility that city level management may be influencing these trends in the street tree communities. And I wanted to connect some of the findings that we had to elements of the Philly Tree Plan, which is a really great strategic plan that is built around equity and environmental justice and deep community engagement. And so a lot of our findings really align with and support some of the objectives within this plan, including strengthening tree planting and replacement requirements related to development and construction, having a tree planting design standard, prioritizing establishment care that would presumably help with the higher rate of mortality for trees that are small, and also developing a proactive inspection cycle. So as of right now, Philadelphia is finally starting to move in that direction. They have a full city street tree inventory for the first time in 100 years. So at the time of our work, there was not a citywide street tree inventory, but the city has since developed one, and they are trying to use that towards a more proactive inspection, pruning, and care cycle for the trees along the streets. So it's a really exciting time to be doing this research in my hometown, the city of Philadelphia. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Here's our email addresses. We would be happy to hear from anybody about this research. And we thank the Tree Fund for sponsoring this work. Turn it back over.
Thank you, Dr. Roman. Thank you, Dr. Fahey, and thank you, Levon. Fantastic presentation. And I think it was really good to see some data. I think anecdotally we've seen some of these things, but to really see some data to support some of these ideas is fantastic. And I think your note that with the Inflation Reduction Act monies that are coming and being able to replicate this in a few years will really be interesting. So thank you all for this. We do have a number of questions and in the Q&A box, and I'll jump in there into a few of you, but if you all see some that you want to jump in on as well, please do so. So the first one I was going to bring up, as I see there was a question here from Chris Madison. He says, given the data you collected, were you able to determine any specifics of mortality based on zoning? Specifically, I know that high density areas have a hard time finding space for trees. Research to determine how to get more trees in high density affordable housing is much needed.
We did not look at zoning explicitly, but that is an excellent point. I mean, you could think of our land use and impervious surface variables as in some ways being a proxy for zoning, but they did not get that explicitly. That would be a great area for further research, especially I think zoning in relation to what the regulations say has to be done with like new developments in different areas. The way it's been described to me by colleagues in Philly Parks and Rec is up until now, and they're working hard to change this, but the street trees come last in consideration for new construction and redevelopment. Everybody else's priorities come first when it comes to placement of different built infrastructure. So yeah, the combination of zoning and how development and redevelopment are handled with respect to the street tree setting would be a great avenue for further investigation.
Thank you. Now, and for any of you all listening in, if you have questions, we have a couple minutes. You can put those into Q&A box. I see one here from Jeff Ramsey. Says, coming from the West Coast, I'm surprised drought tolerance is such a consideration in a summer wet climate out east. Do newly planted trees get regular water with Philly programs, or are they reliant on rain?
It is recommended best practice, even on the wet East Coast, to water trees during establishment, not throughout their entire lives necessarily, but during establishment. There can be drought periods, whether you're in Philadelphia, New England, or the Southeast. So yeah, when the trees experience a week with little rain, that's enough of a drought. Or even like 2 weeks with little rain, that's enough of a drought to really impact them. So yeah, they do recommend getting nice deep watering a couple times a week. I don't know, Bob or Levon, if you want to reflect on that more. I mean, we can't say that every one of these trees was watered that way. They're supposed to be.
Sorry about that. Let's see here. Go through the questions. What else do we have left?
There was a interesting question earlier on, sort of a little more existential, asking about, so we see this decrease in large statured trees, and I think people see that all over the place. So the question was, what can we as urban foresters do to ensure we don't see the extinction of the large street tree in urban areas? So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Laura or Levon, but that's sort of the context here.
Oh, I'll note that there's a lot of very large stature trees existing in spaces in Philadelphia and other older cities where they would no longer be approved. That species would no longer be approved given modern right tree, right place context. That doesn't mean to give up, but it means that there's probably some substantial site redesign that would have to happen to better support those large stature species into the future. But Levon, I invite you to comment because you were a street tree forester in New York City. You know these exact same kind of environments from a siting perspective.
I'm not sure. Did he freeze up?
He might have froze off.
So,
Well, I'll jump. It's a really, I'd actually wrote myself a note with that. It's anecdotally, I'm down here in Alabama. I've seen a decline in large species planted in many sites. And I think you're exactly right, Lara, that I'm kind of wondering if that messaging of right tree, right place for the last few decades has finally taken hold. And of course, cities, I think I have a sense that some of the new regulations, some of the planting spaces are getting smaller and smaller. Down here in the South, the number of crepe myrtles that are now planted in cities, and these are small, medium-sized trees. It's just, I think it's a challenge that we're going to have moving forward in many cities. So it was really interesting to see that in your data.
Yeah, in Philly, it's a lot more service berries, red buds. Cherries have been popular there for a while, but yeah, a lot more small, arguably on the border between a shrub and a tree. But while the decline of the prevalence of some of our large stature species might be seen as a bad thing in terms of shade provisioning and other things that only large trees can do, I want to point out that it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Some of those big trees are in power lines, right? And some of those big trees are, you know, busting up sidewalks. And also some residents have some valid fears from trees of large stature that haven't been taken care of well because cities' budgets have been starved when it comes to street tree management and care. And so it's not that I don't want to see more large stature trees. I do, but it has to be accompanied by all of the investment in care and investment in some site redesign, maybe burying some power lines. There's a lot that would have to happen to better support these large stature trees in terms of community acceptance, as well as practicalities of management and public safety and risk management and so forth.
Those are very, very good points. Thank you, Lara. I look at my clock. We are 1 minute past, so I'll go ahead and start to bring us towards a conclusion. I want to thank our 3 speakers today for sharing their research on this study. It was very, very interesting. I think very informative. Thank you all very much. I want to thank Heath Hupke with Tree Fund, who makes this webinar series possible, gets us advertised so that all of y'all are able to join when we do these on Tuesdays. I just want to throw out a reminder related to CEUs for those who maybe joined a couple minutes late. We will be submitting those CEUs to ISA on your behalf. When you registered, you provided your name and CEU information, so we have that data, and we're going to send it to ISA in the next few days. And so once again, thanks to all of you for today's webinar, and we'll be back in November with Dr. Greg Dahl. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks, everyone.